Hello everyone, I'm a fake internet historian, and today I'd like to talk about how we engage with historical actors as symbols in the present day. And to do so, I'd like to talk about a certain revolutionary leader that you're probably familiar with. Thanks for coming. Born to a well-off family, he did not want for the resources necessary for a proper education, quickly gaining a reputation among friends and family as a voracious learner and curious thinker. It was only natural that he found himself traveling abroad through the great wild spaces between the cities. The travels, trade work, and tribulations of his youth proved formative, and when the winds of rebellion rose, he found himself on a crash course with revolution. The skills and perspectives of his youth would prove valuable to the cause, and quickly rose to be one of the most important commanders in the army. Hard times would follow during the war years. Shortages in manpower, supplies, and money made every day a struggle to keep the army together, but cohesion was maintained by his charisma and a strict discipline enforced on the rank and file. After years of toil and hardship, the revolution was ultimately successful, and he played a foundational role in the early years of the new government. He set to work establishing the new state and establishing precedents that last to this day. But in the end, he chose to step aside and leave the government to pursue other goals, embodying the idea that no one person was truly indispensable to the cause. Why this primer on someone that everyone watching this is probably already familiar with? Well, see, I pulled a little bit of a commie fast one on ya. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's not very nice. Here I am clicking on your video, and the first thing you do is pulse a bunch of communist tomfoolery on me. And, well, fair enough. But it's a handy way of illustrating an important point. Often the facts of a historical figure's life, and at times even their explicit positions or prescriptions, have very little to do with the way we engage with them and their legacy in the present day. And these two men happen to make a particularly apt comparison. So, what exactly is it then about these two men that makes them useful for our little case study? First and foremost, the similarities between them are actually more plentiful than one might think based on one's initial gut reaction. Secondly, one of these men holds a very hallowed place in the pantheon of American heroes and is generally regarded as an admirable figure, even if some of his faults are well known, like slavery. Just about everyone is familiar with the legend of Washington cutting down his father's cherry tree, and his name adorns countless schools, libraries, streets, and institutions. There are statues of him all around the country. He has a massive monolith in our nation's capital specifically dedicated to honoring his legacy. He's taught about at all levels of education in the United States, and just about everyone knows who he is. And regardless of your feelings on the man from an ethical point of view, he exercised an incredible amount of influence on the founding of the United States. Bringing this all together, he's a person that commands an overwhelmingly positive perception in the US. At the same time, opinions on Che Guevara are extremely divided. While it's true that many leftists and young people see him in a positive light, the more common positions are either flat out not knowing who he is, or
they'd love to put posters of Che Guevara on the wall because he was a young, rugged-looking revolutionary. Now, mind you, it's a homicidal maniac who tortured and murdered people. But the left idealizes him, and it really is sad.
First of all, I think Jay-Z needs to get informed. One of his heroes is Che Guevara. Che Guevara was a racist. Che Guevara was a racist that wrote extensively about the superiority of white Europeans over people of African descent. So he should inform himself on the guy that he's propping up.
Really not particularly caring for the guy, to put it lightly. By and large in the US, the people who hate Che are probably all about George Washington, considering his widespread positive image and place as one of the founders of the country, which, by the by, is why we're here trying to make this comparison in the first place. The more nitpicky way that such comparisons can be troublesome is in the nitty-gritty details. These are what I like to call the well-actually minutiae of their stories. Like, it's no secret that George Washington was quite a bit older when he got his military command in the Continental Army than Che was when he was given command of a column under Castro, or even that Che was under the command of Castro while Washington was the commander-in-chief of the army. I say these are relatively unimportant to the point we're making here because they aren't really all that relevant to the issue at hand concerning their respective historical narratives. Rather than looking at the small details of their lives that differ, we want to understand the impactful events and actions of their lives that help form the basis of our symbolic understanding of them. For instance, the fact that Washington worked as a surveyor and Che was trained as a doctor aren't what most people are taking away from their legacy. Further, the point of making these comparisons at all is to show how two different things are alike, which would be impossible if we just started from the position of, yeah, but they're different, so checkmate. The second issue would be one of anachronism. These two men came from different times, true, but it's important to remember that the core of what we're doing today is comparing the way that their legacies as symbols and the lives that they led as historical figures intersect in the current day. That anachronism is precisely the point. We're trying to understand how our views of these men can change over time, and what about their legacies, both symbolic and real, survives the changing zeitgeist of society. And that's my cat trying to get into the bedroom. So, caveats out of the way. What a person chooses to emphasize about a given historical figure can tell you a lot about their ideological outlook on the world. So I want to use Che and Washington as a case study for how this plays out in practice. Let's cover the most prominent criticisms of Che and see how they stack up compared to George Washington, so we can really pin down where the divide in perception is coming in. Now, as we move on over to my very impressive library, stacked to the ceiling with many of the classics of my discipline, we should discuss the most common criticisms of Che that one is likely to encounter. 1. He was a racist. 2. He was a homophobe. 3. He was a murderer. And 4. He was a communist, which is normally framed in the context of stealing property from people during and after the revolution. You see all of these leveled at Che, and while one might think that the last is the one you'd encounter the most often, that's not been my experience, though more on that in part 3. At first pass, one might think this demonstrates a clear stance against, well, all of those things, at least in the abstract. Most people agree that being a racist or a homophobe or a murderer is wrong, and well, obviously. But the devil's in the details, and comparing a person's views on one historical figure versus another historical figure can be revealing. After all, George Washington was not only a racist, he literally owned black people as slaves, which is kind of white supremacist by definition, if we're being honest. In fact, one scholar summarized his views thusly: blacks were ignorant and shiftless, they were careless, deceitful, and liable to act without any qualms of conscience. At the same time, Che definitely held racist views during his younger years. The black is indolent and a dreamer, spending his meager wage on frivolity and drink. The European has a tradition of work and saving, which has pursued him as far as this corner of America, and drives him to advance himself, even independently of his own individual aspirations. However, unlike Washington, he clearly renounced these views. Che's explicit came after his conversion to Marxism, and to take one example, here's a statement he gave while addressing the UN. Those who kill their own children and discriminate daily against them because of the color of their skin, those who let the murderers of blacks remain free, protecting them and furthermore punishing the black population because they demand their legitimate rights as free men, how can those who do this consider themselves guardians of freedom? We understand that today the Assembly is not in a position to ask for explanations of these acts. It must be clearly established, however, that the government of the United States is not the champion of freedom, but rather the perpetuator of exploitation and oppression against all the peoples of the world and against a large part of its own population. Che not only served with Afro-Cubans during the Cuban Revolution, he helped enshrine racial equality in Cuba after the revolution, and then went on to leave his position in the government, to travel to the Congo and assist in the leftist Simba rebellion. Of course, racism as a concept is an extremely complex topic, but it's pretty clear that Che had repudiated the racism of his youth in word, deed, and association. Now, as to the case of murder, that gets pretty dicey when understood in a historical context. Both Che and Washington were soldiers actively fighting in armed conflicts, as well as both having a reputation for being strict disciplinarians. In his general orders for July 4, 1775, Washington wrote, "It is required and expected that exact discipline be observed, and due subordination prevail through the whole army, as a failure in these most essential points must necessarily produce extreme hazard, disorder, and confusion, and end in shameful disappointment and disgrace." In his book on guerrilla warfare, Che wrote, "The essential qualities of the guerrilla fighter in this situation are discipline, perhaps in the highest degree of all. We have records of both men executing members of their respective armies for things such as murder, sedition, rape, banditry, and desertion. Both certainly killed other men while in combat, or at the very least, ordered men into battle with the express purpose of killing their enemies. But whether or not this qualifies as murder in your mind is going to depend on how you define it. Pacifists will obviously disagree with guerrillas or soldiers on that point, but most people do not typically understand military killings during a war to be murders. At the same time, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that only one of these men was involved in genocide and deliberate acts of terror against civilian populations. From Washington. The expedition you are appointed to command is to be directed against the hostile tribes of the 6 nations of Indians, with their associates and adherents. The immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements, and capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent their planting any more. So that's gonna be, what's the 18th century equivalent of yikes? Their experiences after the war do differ on this count, however, as Che was appointed to a 5-month stint as the head of La Cabaña prison in Havana, and tasked with running the tribunals for members of the military and police that were involved in the crimes of the Batista regime. Overall, depending on what sources you believe, around 55 to 105 people were tried by tribunals under Che's control and executed by firing squad. And while there are many paths one could go down in criticizing this, it's important to note that these tribunals were modeled after the Nuremberg trials, and it's hardly absurd to suggest that such sordid crimes committed by the Batista regime be punished. Che biographer John Lee Anderson writes, Che took great care in selecting judges and prosecutors. For instance, rebels who had been mistreated were not allowed to pass judgment on their former torturers. And speaking of the tribunals more generally, they were above board with summary affairs, with defense lawyers, witnesses, prosecutors, and an attending public. Che warned his judges to be scrupulous about weighing the evidence in each case so as to not give the revolution's enemies additional ammunition. But the trials had to continue if Cuba's revolution was to be secure. Now, does it qualify as murder to put the military and police, as they were the only ones who could be executed during these tribunals, on trial and mete out death sentences for their crimes against the people, including torture and murder? As someone who's against the death penalty generally, I'm inclined to say that other punishments would make a better and more moral course, but there are a lot of pro-death penalty people in the US, even in times of peace and for lesser offenses, and I don't see many hardcore Washingtonians out in the streets calling George W. Bush a mass murderer for the 154 executions that he signed off on while the governor of Texas. Regardless, this is where I'm actually willing to give George Washington some credit for when he was faced with a similar situation in the aftermath of the Whiskey Rebellion, which, by the way, is an exceedingly interesting and oft glossed over event in American history that you should all look into. George Washington pardoned the only 2 men convicted of treason for their part in the rebellion, saying, "The misled have abandoned their heirs, and pay the respect to our Constitution and laws which is due from good citizens to the public authorities of the society. These circumstances have induced me to pardon generally the offenders here referred to, and to extend forgiveness to those who had been adjudged to capital punishment." Now, is it fair to compare Che executing members of Batista's military and police that had been found guilty of torture and murder under the previous regime to Washington's pardoning of men with legitimate grievances who rose up in rebellion against a government that had just recently formed by rebellion? Perhaps not, but I leave that to you. While I do give Washington credit for that decision, we need to again be reminded that he was doing some manifest destinying at the time, and while his record with American Indians is certainly better than, say, Andrew Jackson... Can you believe it? Kids these days with Che Guevara t-shirts out in the streets, protesting and going home to walls covered in Che Guevara posters, venerating a mass murderer, splashing his face upon all of these places that indicate that they really look up to him, that his memory is worthy of being carried forward. No. Fortunately, some of us have a bit more sense than that. He still had his eye on the expansion of the United States westward, an endeavor which, by its very nature, involved violence. Historian Colin Calloway writes, But Washington's involvement with the West was lifelong, and he consistently looked to Western land for his own personal fortune and for the nation's future. Securing Indian country as a national resource was essential to national consolidation and expansion, and few people knew more about securing Indian land than he did. Now, for perhaps the most interesting question from a historical perspective, at least to me, what were their respective views on gay people? Well, insofar as I can find, we don't have anything explicitly outlining Washington's views on homosexuality, as it wasn't really a concept, at least not as we understand it today. I don't want to go too far down that anachronistic rabbit hole because, one, there are people far more qualified than myself to speak on that issue, and two, the concept of gayness is complicated enough in our own times, let alone trying to investigate it into the past in a discussion about historical symbolism. What we can say, however, is that George Washington was at least tolerant and accepting of some people who were rumored to engage in what we would now understand to be homosexual relationships. Friedrich von Steuben was a Major General, Inspector General of the Continental Army, and Chief of Staff for Washington through the last couple years of the American War for Independence. And the historical evidence we have definitely seems to suggest that he was gay, and more to the point, Washington almost certainly knew about it. On the flip side, I can't really find mention of Che's explicit views on gay people. According to John Lee Anderson, Che had openly homosexual people in his orbit, seemingly without incident or him persecuting them for it. But at the same time, Cuba was known to be a fairly homophobic place during that time, and there was an ever-present ideal of machismo that was often framed as mutually exclusive with homosexuality. Surprising. Regardless, it's worth pointing out that it's just kind of weird that the far-right people would be so upset about this anyway, since conservatives haven't exactly been a bulwark of gay rights over the years. And at the tip of the brainworm scale, you even get people like the internet's favorite Arthur the Aardvark character, Steven Crowder, selling "Socialism is for t-shirts. And look, I get that lots of internet conservative talking heads really struggle with what they call irony, but I'm really struggling to interpret that as anything other than blatant homophobia. Hint, because that's what it is. The point here is that we only have so much to go on with regards to our modern understanding of LGBTQ+ issues, and that inserting that into the past, especially in lieu of any concrete evidence, is somewhat problematic. Suffice it to say that both Cuba and the United States were not great places to be gay up until fairly recently, even if Che and Washington probably didn't have too much to do with that personally. Bit of an aside here, I kept this discussion to homosexuality specifically and not to a broader LGBTQ+ reading because, one, that's what most criticisms of Che specifically mention, and two, while such a reading is certainly possible, textual evidence would be more geared towards understanding Che or Washington's general feelings about gender and sexuality in the context of their own respective societies, and would require a video of its own by someone far more qualified than I am. So, where does all of this leave us? So that's 3 points down and 1 to go. And this last point, at least in my experience, seems to be the one that gets brought up the least often, oddly enough. Che was a communist revolutionary and outspoken critic of American empire. This is a point where you really have to hand it to him. That's just flat out true. Which, coincidentally, gets us to the core of the issue. Very often, the discourse surrounding historical figures is prone to various
logical fallacies.
Historical figures that are generally liked by a given group tend to be idealized by that group, while historical actors that are generally disliked by a group tend to be demonized by that group, which really isn't all that surprising. People like to think the best of people that they already think well of, or people that they perceive as being more like them. For instance, it's probably a bit harder for someone to convince you that your best friend is a murderer than some random person you've never heard of. With historical figures, this dynamic takes on a different dimension, as these figures come with ideological associations and a host of little bits of information about them and their lives that can color the way that people view them. Let's take a more neutral example, at least from the American context, and talk about the big one. That's right, folks. Napoleon Bonaparte. What does your average American know about Napoleon? 1. French dude. Pretty sure anyway. He did like so many wars and tried to conquer everything. Invaded Russia, which, really bad move. If I had been Napoleon, I definitely would have passed on that. Most importantly, he was short. Like, so short. And very angry about it. At least in my experience as someone who was once a flared user in Napoleonic history on the Ask Historians subreddit. The fourth is probably the most well-known. This belief is so pervasive that we have a made-up psychological condition in the form of the Napoleon complex to denote short people who act in a bellicose manner to make up for their lack of physical stature. Napoleon Bonaparte, probably one of the most influential people of the last 250 years, is now best known in America for being a symbol of short people overcompensating for their shortness via global conquest. And I don't really know what to take from that. There's just one problem with that. He wasn't short for his time. Yeah, that universally known fact about Napoleon is completely false. He was probably 5'6" or 5'7", either average height or slightly above average height for his time, with virtually no primary sources that I've ever come across commenting on any sort of short stature. So how did this come to be? Well, it's that hodgepodge of factoids and ideology that I was talking about earlier. For one thing, there was a discrepancy between British and French inches in the time before the metric system was introduced by Napoleon. So it appears as though he was shorter than he actually was. This being handy for British propaganda, they ran with it, as you can see in all these fine examples, to paint him as a little upstart, lost among the real giants of the age, well-born traditional aristocrats. So if you're living in a place where in-depth knowledge of him just isn't floating around, and you really only know about him what propagandists wanted you to know about him, then that's not going to paint the most flattering portrait. In this instance, the truth value of his height doesn't really matter, because people only have so much to go on, both at the time and in the present day. And voila! A historical symbol is born. But it can work in the opposite direction as well. Take the closing lines from the polemic The Wars Against Napoleon by Michele Franceschi and Ben Weider. Napoleon, like a titan, dominated his epoch, and indeed all history from an amazing height. His Homeric epics seem based in Greek mythology, and will doubtless join similar epics for the ages to come. His reforms and ideals created the basis of the modern era, and were fought by those who feared the future. Like Prometheus, Napoleon committed the crime of stealing the fire of heaven and giving it to mankind. Now, I can definitely understand some skepticism there, but it is intended to be a polemical book, and it's not really too outrageous of a viewpoint when looked at from their perspective. It comes down to what a person emphasizes about the history of Napoleon and how one views him as a symbol. The idea of Che the Communist works in much the same way. It's no secret that the United States was opposed to Che personally in many ways. The US backed the Batista regime, American capitalists had huge stakes in Cuba. The US backed the Bay of Pigs invasion. Che was adamant in his denunciations of American empire, etc. In the same way, many Cuban expats in the United States can directly trace their time in America back to the closing days of the Cuban Revolution, and many of them stood to lose property, or in some cases their freedom or lives, if they stuck around. Notable among them, Nuncio Batista. Shocking, right? For those keeping score at home, we have 1. Direct opposition from the United States, both in the public and private sectors. 2. A vocal population of expats that have a material and ideological reason for hating him. And 3. A general zeitgeist of anti-communism in the United States for a host of reasons that are too numerous to get into here. You whip those together, and we have the ingredients for creating a historical symbol, regardless of the facts of his life or the truth value of the myriad charges leveled against him after the fact. Now, far be it from me to tell someone that they're wrong for how they interpret the morality of historical figures. I'm not going to get on a pedestal and say that actually everything Che did was good, including the communism, and you just have to live with it. In fact, there are plenty of criticisms to make of Che from the left. Criticisms I would encourage you to look into, many of which I would share. One critic on the left, Mike Gonzalez, summarized his criticisms thusly. So what should we do with this flawed revolutionary icon? Recognize that his high moral standards, his resolute internationalism, and his egalitarianism were qualities to cherish. But the one-party state he favored and its repression of democracy consigned the subjects of revolution to a position in which self-emancipation became impossible, as the self-proclaimed vanguard usurped their role, at first in the name of revolution, but soon, and in the absence of any possibility of control from below, in their own self-interest. And while criticisms based in historical fact or an ideological framework are certainly valid, many of the most commonly voiced criticisms of him coming from the right are false, exaggerated, or equally applicable to historical actors that people on the right would typically hold in high regard. In so doing, what I'm really trying to illustrate are the ways in which the study of history and the actors contained therein can illuminate many of the biases and predispositions of the societies we live in, and that rather than focusing on aspects of a given figure that don't hold up to scrutiny, instead cut to the core of the matter and criticize what you actually want to criticize. Dragging Che for being a communist makes sense if you're an anti-communist, but the issue with this is that it requires one to take an active stance against the tenets of Marxism, communism, leftism, what have you, which is quite a bit different from taking a stance against murderers, homophobes, and racists, which are all things that we've more or less decided are wrong. Broadly speaking, work with me here. Anyone can make these criticisms without worrying about how it might reflect upon them, while criticizing Che's communism comes with the extra ideological baggage. His agrarian policies gave land to peasants who had previously been beholden to landlords or had never had any land to work at all. His literacy program virtually eradicated illiteracy. During the Revolution, he would act as a doctor for towns and communities who had literally never had one visit in living memory. While some would disagree, Che saw these decisions and actions as being directly inspired by the fact that he was a communist. And arguing against his communism would therefore mean arguing against these actions that most people would find unobjectionable or even laudable. Che, while hardly perfect, took a far more egalitarian view to his politics than George Washington. As we saw when comparing their records, Che was generally closer to what we would consider to be an acceptable egalitarian outlook on people and society. And it's not as if these can be brushed off by calling it an anachronism. There were people in Washington's own time advocating for the abolition of slavery, Thomas Paine to take one example, and that seems to be something that Washington himself deeply understood, considering the manumission of his slaves after the death of his wife, which is pretty telling to say the least. So when compared to the life of George Washington, there are some really stark similarities and stark differences that can't just be glossed over by saying, well, those were different times. Instead, we need to grapple with the things that distinguish these two historical figures in order to better understand what distinguishes the reaction to them as symbols throughout history and up to the current day. Different symbols mean different things to different people in different times. Of course, we have the George Washington of Mount Rushmore and the dollar bill, but we also have the George Washington of this Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden and the fascist symbology of BioShock Infinite. Sorry, I hear that video games need to be mentioned at least once in any leftist video on the internet. In the same way, we have Che the hated communist, Che the symbol of youthful rebellion, Che the Marxist revolutionary, and yes, Che the woke consumer brand. While these symbols are originally drawn from a historical figure, they're also separate from them, and what you find when comparing the men as opposed to the symbols is that the main sticking point for many people is that Che was a communist. A Marxist revolutionary who died fighting for his convictions. Convictions, by the by, that were in direct opposition to American empire. And perhaps most importantly of all, that he remains a symbol of that all the way up to the present day. In this way, it's not the man himself that's the source of their ire. It's this. You can make the case that this image is one of the most recognizable images in the entire world, and it still carries real power. It's the symbol of the man and what he represents in the hearts and minds of people the world over to this very day that is still carried forward. From the Zapatistas in the mountains of Chiapas to Indians marching for workers' rights, and yes, even to conservatives in the US Senate, Che remains a powerful symbol of rebellion, revolution, international solidarity, and bold action in the face of oppression, which not incidentally is why he's still so polarizing. And I think even Che knew this. After he was captured and facing execution, his last words were, "Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." Perhaps in that last moment, even he was in some way predicting the way in which Che the man would one day be replaced by Che the symbol. Hasta la victoria siempre, comandante.
Aprendimos a quererte desde la historia.